Is intermittent fasting associated with premature death? Let's take a look at some research. Hello, I'm Dr. Sam, this is Dr. Sam's Health, and today we'd like to talk about one very interesting and unfortunately very controversial study. Several days ago there was a conference by American Heart Association, and as part of its proceedings they have published an abstract and later on poster of an epidemiological study that essentially linked intermittent fasting or time-restricted eating to higher risk of premature death due to cardiovascular factors. Obviously, you can see why this study is so controversial. There are already lots of health experts, YouTubers, bloggers, vloggers who are talking about this study, mostly in a very negative way. And as a medical doctor, I literally feel that I'm obliged to provide my, let's call it, second opinion. Before we proceed, my regular disclaimers. As I said, I'm a medical doctor, but I do not provide any kind of medical advice over YouTube, for sure. I express my opinions that are based on decades of medical training, research that I've done, clinical expertise, and so on, but these opinions do not necessarily represent the opinions of my colleagues, my discipline, psychiatry, or my colleges or regulatory bodies. Also, I would like to add that I'm somewhat biased towards intermittent fasting in general. I speak about it in my book. Also, I would like to say that though I am biased towards intermittent fasting, I'm not heavily biased. I do talk about it in my book. I do recommend it for some people when it is appropriate. I do believe that there are certain health benefits associated with that. I do believe that it helps to lose weight if it is paired with consistent caloric deficit, or caloric deficit, I would say, is introduced by intermittent fasting. But in the grand scheme of things, I don't think it makes huge difference. Having said that, let's get to the abstract. Unfortunately, I won't be able to show you the poster or the abstract just because it looks like they explicitly prohibit such use of these materials, but I've got them in front of me, and they're in public access. I will add the link to the poster and abstract and author's comments on that just for your information. Meanwhile, you'll have to rely on me talking about that. So let's dive in. First and foremost, let's talk about the study design. That's the key element in any kind of critical review of a study, poster, article. The authors have used the data from National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. The reference time period is between 2003 and 2018, so they had 15 years of data. Sounds like a lot, but actually you will see that it is not a lot at all. So the main source of information is food logs or food frequency questionnaires that they use as part of this survey. This survey, by the way, is a huge survey that's been run for many years. It's famous, and there are a couple of things that must be said here. First of all, they're using this food logs, and I believe that this is one of the worst sources of information ever, because if you pick a random person and ask them what they have eaten today, the information they will provide will be very biased, usually incomplete. There might be some exaggerations. They had to exclude quite a few participants who produced food logs that would include like 10,000 calories a day, which is virtually impossible for some people to achieve. So there are lots of invalid data. Second, for this study, they had data on 2 food logs for 2 days, essentially, over the course of this 15 years. Obviously, not every participant was followed for 15 years. There were people who had shorter follow-up period, people who had longer follow-up period, but in general, for 40,000 people, 43, almost 44,000 people, they had data from 2 days of their eating. I believe that it's a terrible source of information because of recall bias. If you ask anybody to produce some sort of a food log, it will be somewhat unreliable data. Plus, I don't think that 1 day of food logging will represent the typical nutrition pattern. They tend to change over time, and also in general, you can just pick some random day, and the foods that the person is consuming in this particular day not necessarily will represent the typical nutritional pattern. Having said that, they had the data on nutrition, 2 days of nutrition for 44,000 people, almost 44,000 people. They have excluded a lot of people from this study due to a variety of potential problems with their food logs, specifically people who would provide very unreliable data. Plus, they excluded some people who didn't have follow-up data, people who were pregnant, people who were not able to recall their food intake, and so on and so on and so on. And interestingly enough, out of almost 44,000 participants, they have excluded more than half of them, and they ended up with just 20,000 of participants. This is a huge red flag, and I wouldn't say that it kind of invalidates the study, but it shows that, in a study, in a survey where more than half of data logs are invalidated, it's kind of a problematic start. Having said that, I think that this study actually illustrates really well the huge problem in general with nutritional research that we can get from our hands on. So there are quite a few nutritional studies. They are usually epidemiological observation studies. This one is essentially a cohort study. And in theory, it's a great study design, but you can see that in practice, you have to invalidate more than half of the responses. It's getting kind of problematic. So I would say that the study sample of 20,000 people is already quite biased. Okay, the next step was to divide all the study participants, 20,000 people, into several categories depending on the duration of their food intake interval. So they had several categories: people who were consuming all their food within 8 hours a day, people who are consuming their food between 8 and 10 hours, 10 and 12 hours, 12 and 16 hours, and those who were essentially eating all day long, their food consumption interval was more than 16 hours. After dividing the participants or creating the spectrum of different food intake intervals, they have provided some baseline characteristics of these cohorts of subjects. And I would like to review them because it is actually very important to see if there are any discrepancies between these cohorts. So first of all, the numbers. The largest cohort was obviously people who are consuming their food, all of their food, within the time interval somewhere between 12 and 16 hours, which I think represents a very typical pattern of nutrient intake. Interestingly enough, it's more than half of the patients, it's almost 12,000 of them, or subjects, who have been consuming food this way. They obviously used it as a reference category, which is important to know. There were very small number of participants who were actually consuming all their food within 8-hour interval, just 414 subjects. So I think it makes it at the level of approximately 2% out of the whole cohort. Actually, some people criticize this study specifically for that saying that only 2% of people were in the very time-restricted eating interval. I don't think it's a problem, to be honest. It doesn't invalidate anything in this study whatsoever. I think it's a very natural distribution, just because if you take random people in the population, and the study interval began in 2003 when people were not even talking about intermittent fasting at all, and you got vast majority of people who are consuming food in the kind of traditional interval, likely having breakfast, lunch, dinner, some snacks in between, and only a small proportion of these people are consuming food within 8-hour interval. I would also ask a huge question, which would be, was it intentional? I assume that there are some people who just skip breakfast, maybe don't have time to have lunch, and essentially they consume their food naturally within 8-hour interval in the evening, for example. And I wouldn't call it intermittent fasting. And also, again, if you are just using 2 days out of 15 years, it's quite likely that you will come across somebody who literally skipped breakfast on that day. So that's my criticism, actually. We should also take a look at the baseline characteristics of this cohorts of subjects just because we want usually to see that these cohorts are comparable in terms of age, sex distribution, racial distribution, or ethnic distribution, and so on. And I already see some problems with these cohorts, and I will specifically highlight a couple of them. So age-wise, actually people who were intermittently fasting or consuming food within 8-hour interval, they were much, much younger than the general cohort. So people in overall in this cohort were approximately 48.5 years of age. People in the reference category were 49.5 years of age, and you can see that there is no discrepancy between general cohort age and the specific reference cohort. But people who were consuming food within 8-hour window, they were, looks like almost 7 years younger. They were 41.3 years of age on average. There were slightly more men in this cohort in comparison to the general population. There were surprisingly low number of white people. Just half of the people in this subpopulation were white. Whereas in reference category, like a typical food consumption, over three quarters of subjects were white. Also, I think the key element here is the current smoking status. It looks like in general, there were almost 18% of smokers in the whole population. This number was almost the same, 17% in the reference cohort. And it was ridiculously higher in the cohort of people who are consuming their food within 8-hour interval. 27.1% of them were smokers. And I think that this one specific characteristic indicates at least a couple of things. First of all, I think we can use smoking as a proxy for overall health status and overall socioeconomic status. And what I see here is that likely these people who were consuming food within 8-hour interval were way less healthy than the general population, and accordingly much more likely to suffer from negative health outcomes later in life. And also they were of poorer socioeconomic status, and there is a good chance that actually the reason why they skipped breakfast essentially was just because they were busy working multiple jobs, or they didn't have money to afford 3 meals a day. It is a stretch, but I would like this thought to like persist a little bit, percolate, because I think it's super important to keep it in mind. So the chances of a person being a smoker in this cohort were 60% higher than in the reference cohort. Just keep this number in mind. In terms of BMI, there was almost no discrepancy. There was slight variations. They had the highest BMI, but it was 29.9 versus 28.5 in the reference cohort. Also, in terms of percentage of cardiovascular disease, 8.6% of them had pre-existing cardiovascular problems versus 7.7% in reference cohorts, so slightly higher. They produced some statistic here, which is a percentage of people who have cancer, and they specifically say they have cancer. And I find this number here is just ridiculous. It's like every 9th person, 11% of the general population in this study had cancer. I think it's a ridiculously high number to begin with. So I've got a question like what kind of people they were surveying. But also, interestingly enough, these people, they are younger and they have the lowest percentage of people with cancer, 7.3% versus 11.1% in the reference cohort. One thing that is missing here, and something I would really love to see, is the amount of calories they consumed on a daily basis. They didn't produce this data. I hope that maybe in the article they will publish eventually, this data will be there. And that is pretty much it about the baseline characteristics. So they have taken these people, this several cohorts or sub-cohorts of subjects, and followed them up for quite a few years. And then they used certain statistical methods to evaluate the risks of dying in general, or dying from cardiovascular problems or cancer. Interestingly enough, there was no statistically significant indication that people who were in the time-restricted eating sample were at higher risk of dying in general. Though if you take a look at the forest plot there, you will see that actually people with shorter food intake interval, they were much more likely to die, though it was not statistically significant. The same applies for cancer mortality, but what the most interesting part of the study is the cardiovascular mortality. So here they were actually able to indicate that people who were consuming their food within 8-hour interval on a daily basis, they were much more likely, almost twice more likely to die due to cardiovascular issues. To summarize their findings, in the general sample, people who were consuming their food within 8-hour interval were almost twice as likely to die from cardiovascular issues as compared to the reference category. People who had pre-existing cardiovascular disease were even more likely to die. It was like extra 107%. And people with pre-existing cancer their risk of dying from cardiovascular issues was literally triple. Obviously, this is very worrisome outcomes, and that is something that should definitely be taken into consideration. Likely, this kind of research will pave the road for further exploration, but I am still not convinced that intermittent fasting is linked or is a causative factor for cardiovascular mortality. Forgive me, but we have reviewed the study parameters. We can see that it is a very flawed study, just because the data on food consumption is, quite frankly, very minimal and, quite frankly, not reliable at all. I don't have much trust in the food frequency questionnaires or food logs. It is very difficult to track. It is self-reported, not very reliable. I would say that the data on smoking, for example, is like 100 times more reliable. Just because if you're a smoker, you will say, I'm a smoker. Yes, no. There is one parameter that is very easy to actually identify and to incorporate into your studies. And speaking of smoking, I actually see a clear association between smoking status and the risk of cardiovascular mortality. As I said, when we were talking about the baseline characteristics, the cohort of people who were eating within 8-hour window, the huge percentage of them were smokers, much higher percentage than in the reference category. And actually, if we take a look at the distribution of percentage of smokers between cohorts and the risk of cardiovascular mortality, we can clearly see that there is a very strong correlation there. I'm not sure if their final forest plot that they have produced in this study, if you take a look at it, shows the adjusted risk ratios or unadjusted. I assume that it would be adjusted, but quite frankly, having described all of the flaws of the study and the clear-cut confounding parameter, which is smoking and likely socioeconomic status and different ethnic distribution and different age and different pre-existing medical conditions distribution, I think that this study doesn't really prove anything. We do use cohort studies to establish causality. They are just like second best in comparison to randomized controlled trials or controlled trials in general. But we've got a number of confounders. We've got a I cannot say poorly designed, but poorly collected data. Unfortunately, that's the best we have. Uh, and I think that this study is important. It's important to publish things like that. It's important to talk about the risks associated with different nutritional patterns, but also everything has to be taken with a grain of salt. So my personal take from this study has little to do with intermittent fasting. Based on everything that I have reviewed and what I've seen, and all the knowledge that I have about health, public health, health outcomes, and risk factors, I would say that it's safe to assume that likely the main cause for cardiovascular mortality in this study is smoking and lower socioeconomic status, lower health status in this cohort of people who happened to skip breakfast and fall into this category of people who are consuming food within 8 hours. And it's, again, not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily mean that these people are engaging in intermittent fasting. They just happen to consume food within 8-hour interval on the days when the survey was conducted. So that would be pretty much it. I don't think it's a bad study, by the way. I think it's an important study that will likely pave the way for further research. And this research hopefully will be able to disentangle different parameters, like rule out certain confounders, adjust for them properly. And definitely there's more research that is needed, which is usually a conclusion of most of the studies I've seen. But at the same time, I must say that it is important to publish things like that because they evoke a lot of thinking, a lot of analysis, and they allow for planning further research. Having said that, that will be it for today. Thank you for watching. I would really appreciate if you hit the like button, subscribe, leave some comments to help me with algorithm, and I will be happy to answer your questions if you post them in the comment section for this video, and or if you have some unrelated questions, feel free to post them too, comment, and I will be able to address them in some future videos. That was a very interesting exercise for me, and I'm happy that I am able to actually present my thoughts on that. Thank you so much, and I'll see you in my next videos. All the very best.